Welcome everybody. This is David Richard Gallery in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and today we're going to have a discussion for artist John Vokoun here and the exhibition that's up currently in our gallery. And we're going to have this hosted by Kathryn Davis, ArtBeat Live. And so this is, I think, our second or third of these Facebook Live events. So anyway, we're starting on time this time. So anyway, so I'm going to leave it to these two to have the discussion. Kathryn will moderate. And if any of you in the audience here in Santa Fe or online have questions, feel free. Just send them in and we'll try and take questions as we come along. Otherwise, we'll kind of wait till the end if you guys are really in the middle of something.
Well, I have a plan for that.
Oh, good. I like a person with a plan.
David.
Oh, you're welcome.
I appreciate it.
Bye.
That was David Eichholz of David Richard Gallery, by the way.
The book.
The book.
The book.
The book. Oh, no, not the
It's
book.
not like the list in Devil Wears Prada.
Well, I wanted to welcome everyone to this discussion of John Vokoun's installation. This is his inaugural installation or exhibition with David Richard Gallery, and the title of this exhibition is Horizon Structures. There's definitely a backstory to it. It's based on John spending time as an artist in a residency at Chaco Canyon. So we're going to get into that, but I wanted to backtrack and tell you, I think how we'll do things is we're going to kind of have subjects, and I'll try and keep track of what they are, because it's always so easy when you get excited about something to go off on tangents. I'm the worst at that. But I do usually manage to bring things back around. So we'll have you ask questions kind of at the end of a subject. We'll open it up for, this will all make sense. So we'll be talking and then questions and then talking and then questions. And those of you in Facebook land, please send in your questions and we will do our very, very best to answer your questions or pose your questions. If they're really good questions, I probably don't have an answer. I wanted to say thank you very much to Michael Abate Marco, who wrote an article in Pasatiempo, this week's Pasatiempo, on the show, on John Vokoun's show, Making Art Off the Grid. It's a nice article and it really does help you understand exactly where John has been coming from. So, your background. You were at computer camp when you were 9.
Yes.
So,
But I'm not a programmer, but I was.
so tell us about that situation and how I think you've grown up immersed in technology to the point where it's not strange that you're making laser cut paintings, even though the rest of us are thinking, we don't even know what that is.
Yeah, so I remember programming camp on an Apple IIe.
Back when they were apples.
You know,
Yeah.
green and black CRT screen. And my biggest interest with it right off the bat was like learning how to program enough so you could make crazy images. And glitches and weird things happen. That to me was the most fascinating part. I didn't actually like the programming itself very much, but it's like, wow, look at this. This makes the most strange art, and it's an interactive process. It's not so deterministic. When you take a pencil and you put it on a piece of paper, it's a very deterministic act. Whether you draw like a picture of a cat or a castle or whatever. And then there are things in our lives that we interact with that just sort of become this play back and forth, and you never know what you're going to get. And that to me sometimes is more fascinating than anything that's determined in some ways.
Well, in a lot of the material that I've read about you, it really indicates, and there's this paradox going on. Your work is technology-based, and we, as a general public, have an understanding of technology in terms of exactitude, perhaps even machine-based creation of things. So this illusion of precision is part of what we think of when we think of something that's computer-based. But you're very interested in how things are not exactly working, how something will pixelate or fragment off from where it was initially set up. So I think what we have to do first is to relieve the tension here and tell everyone how you made your paintings.
Okay, well, I will do that, but I have to say, I really like
Please,
the
comment.
phrase illusion of perfection. It's pretty great. I'll have to think about that for the title of the next show.
It comes from being human for long enough.
Yeah, maybe so. So this body of work that we're showing here at the gallery right now actually has both works that are technology-driven and works that are just man-made, that are made with a lot of precision. So it's sort of a little bit elusive that they're not technology-made. There are several hand-painted pieces in this show. The pieces behind us, though, are both laser-cut paintings. My process is in terms of drawings, is to actually come up with the drawing first and the concept in my mind ahead of time. The drawings do get refined as the work is continued, but what I do is I come up with the drawing and I come up with the kind of the place and the time that matches the drawing. And I paint
You do a freehand drawing.
Yeah, usually. And paint the panels with many, many layers of paint until I kind of have that sort of symmetry worked out in my mind. And the drawings then, at some point in time, have to be turned into computer drawings in order to drive the laser cutter, which is, it's like a CNC machine with like a laser head. And the panels put in the machine and all the layers of paint are basically vaporized away wherever the laser cuts through it.
Does it cut all the way through to the panel?
Usually we can vary the depth of it, and so it kind of depends on how many layers of paint I have on it, but usually I do that, and I cut all the way back down to the panel itself, and then when the panels come out of the machine, all of the vaporized paint kind of like settles down into these layers of like this very fine dust, and it takes tons and tons of cleaning. You have to just clean and scrub and clean. And then once that's completed, there's usually a couple layers of paint then that are added back on top, depending on the piece.
Okay. It's very interesting because what that process reminded me of as an art historian, I can't help but make associations. I started thinking about Willem de Kooning and how a great deal of his process had to do with removing layer after layer after layer of paint, or putting newspaper down to alter the canvas. So even though his paintings wound up looking as if they are pure action expressionist paintings, they're very much thought through, and they take a long time to be made.
Yeah, it's interesting. I haven't really thought about de Kooning in connection with my work in that way, but I do see that in the layers of how the work is kind of developed, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating. So.
And what was the name of the studio you worked with to make these drawings in particular?
So the laser cutting studio in San Remo is called Arroyo Studio.
We want to give them a shout out.
Andrew and Matt are really fantastic. I highly recommend it.
Okay. Now, how about, let's talk about the element of mistake making. How does that enter into what sounds as if it's going to be a precision-driven process?
So I've kind of always had to work as like a computer help desk person my whole life, fixing a lot of computers for people, walking people through software and things. And it's kind of just reminded me that, you know, technologies and machines are really great when they work the way we want them to. And the one like psychological element that's always been so fascinating to me is how utterly frustrated people get when their computers break. Because ultimately when you open it up, it's like at a scale where we can't actually see a mechanism anymore. It's really
It's not mechanical.
It's really dehumanized in a lot of ways.
Right.
And so it's a very intimidating, frustrating thing when these machines break for many, many people. I think that's changing now as we have people that are kind of more born totally into the world where computers are in their lives all the time. But for a lot of people, when, the blue screen goes up and the computers crash and they can't get in it. It's an amazingly upsetting, frustrating process.
Sure.
And I've had to deal with people just utterly crying in tears.
Right.
This is amazing. It's this amazing emotional reaction, and it's because things are going haywire in a way that is not understood. And it's weird too, because we're getting to the point now where our computers are actually, in some ways, more complex than our minds are, and that is kind of a whole new level of challenge in a lot of ways.
I do want to talk about that, the way that we perceive the world now. And I think what we'll do is we'll hold that back for just a few minutes, and I want to ask if anyone has any questions of John about the actual making of his paintings. I normally don't like to spend a lot of time with an artist saying, how do you make this? But I think in this case it would really help to truly understand how these are made. So he seemed clear to me, but there are no stupid questions, trust me. And
Well,
you'll probably ask
I
something
have a
that
question
I needed
that
to know.
The place that does the laser cutting,
Uh-huh.
are they doing it for other people? Is this, like what you're doing looks very original, but are there other people involved in creating?
There are other artists out there. Yeah, I mean, my first interest in laser cutting itself was from a show I saw at the Pompidou in Paris. There was a technology show, a lot of 3D printing and laser cutting a few years ago. And that's where really I decided, okay, I need to see what this can do for me in terms of where I'm at.
And is it usually geometric or what?
Somewhat by the nature of what it is, yes, but even the organic shapes or drawings you might come up with can be laser cut. At the finest level, there's a stepped process to it. It's not inherently organic process just because of XYZ axis, CNC machine, but it can get beyond the human perception level to a point where it could seem very organic.
Exactly. I have a friend who just spent last week at Make Santa Fe working with 3D printing and laser cutting and CDC machine, and she showed me some of the things she had made, and one was a vase that was rather geometric, but no more geometric in its appearance to me than, say, a crystal cut vase. Then she also showed me these little figures of kitty cats that, just this kitschy little pink kitty cat that looked very, we'll use the term organic, organically created. So it was really interesting.
Yeah.
And I think as AI technology becomes more and more familiar to us, we're just going to depend on the illusion of things seeming real. Well, then we're going to get into the Matrix, and I can't believe the illusion of reality.
There's two good lines right there.
Any other
I have
questions?
one.
Yes, ma'am.
Is the kind of umber color we're seeing everywhere in what I can see right here, these 5, is that the actual panel that you've reached? That's the substrate?
Sometimes I've just kind of gone with the color scheme, and sometimes it's paint. Originally, the piece behind my head there actually is a piece that it was kind of it's really minimalistically painted. It's just layers of white paint and the panel material itself. And the patina on it is actually from the vaporized paint and wood fibers. So that piece, a series I did like those was kind of this is the material, But I consider the material to be informative to me. But at this point in time, I think, I don't know. It's one of those things that you just kind of loosely, artistically decide what you think feels right.
But so the laser is cutting sometimes just paint, obviously. It's not cutting back to
That's correct.
Yeah,
Yeah.
wow, that's pretty cool.
But a lot of times I'm like actually painting all the little lines back in.
Uh-huh.
So.
By
The
hand.
number 000 brush.
Yeah. Yeah, I got some triple zeros and various things. I use a lot of styluses too, things like that.
Mhm. Now, I can't help but think about, I'm sorry you guys, Roy Lichtenstein and pop art and the Ben Day dots,
Mhm.
which is how their color used to be laid down, say, on newsprint
Right.
for the funnies, as they called them then, in dots of color. And the way that Lichtenstein or his studio assistants wound up making those Ben Day dots was by hand, because the stencil that he wanted to use, which would hopefully reproduce the experience of making something mechanically, they kept getting clogged, so it didn't work. So this problem has been around for a little while. It's an interesting way of perceiving things, but if there aren't any more questions about process, and I do encourage them, do we have anything
I have-
online? Oh, Bunny, go ahead.
I just was wondering about whether you have a preconceived idea about the colors and the emotional impact they may have, or if it's just spontaneous and you just react to what's going down.
I wish I had a very clear answer. The
I
best
know it's
answer.
a terrible question
Well, no,
to ask
it's
an
a
artist.
good question. The truth is, because of the high level of determinism with my drawings and the precision with my drawings, I tend to let the color work be pretty subconscious, really.
Mhm.
So, this whole series, the concept of horizon, is really about southwestern skies and southwestern earth patterns and things like that. So it comes from studying nature a lot, but very few of these are like direct paintings from nature. There's a couple that started that way as actually plein air paintings out of Chaco Canyon that are in this show. But ultimately, when they're finished, it's all kind of coming out of my mind. So the process for me, in terms of color and color decisions, usually I have a pretty general concept when I start, and just interacting with the painting itself becomes how I kind of finish and determine it. I just kind of let it tell me where it wants to go.
I get it.
Anyone else? Yes, sir.
Can you talk a little bit about how you generate the laser cut patterns and create those templates and sort of what's going on here?
So yeah, I started several years ago really looking at and thinking a lot about corrupted computer data, and there was a point in time in which, after like studying all these like corruptions and chaos and glitch patterns, I started thinking to myself, in some ways it seems like, if you walked into this like unknowing that it was corrupted, that you might try to decipher it and come up with, some Rosetta Stone for trying to figure out what the language would be. And in the course of doing that, I started kind of coming up with my own esoteric, basic language, sort of by shape. And so these drawings are all kind of based on that. It's sort of like weird language that isn't actually a language. But the patterns and the shapes, to me, seem like they're evocative of both language, but also of structures, of architecture. It kind of, for me, feels like, profile view of different structures, also kind of like a overhead view in a lot of different ways. But ultimately, it's supposed to leave the mind to kind of guess. Mnemonic patterns and the concept of the mind trying to form recognizable information where it doesn't exist, to me, is the most fascinating part. It's like what the mind is grasping at, the structures it's trying to come up with. And my work, I feel like, is supposed to never quite fully resolve, but always leave the mind kind of guessing at what those structures might be.
That was a really great question because it did bring up the notions of a vocabulary and also linearity, and how the human mind is going to desperately struggle to make sense of any visual information it's receiving. And I do want to talk more about that in a little bit, but if there aren't any more questions about the process, and my watch decided it didn't want to work anymore. As soon as I said something about timelessness.
You did, you said timelessness, and all of a sudden.
My watch stopped working. So I have a timeless watch rather than a Timex. We need to talk though about, I want us to talk about Chaco Canyon. You spent a month there as a resident, an artist resident.
Yes.
Tell us about that. What is the program?
It's through the National Parks Art Foundation, and they have art residencies in several different national parks throughout the country. The one at Chaco Canyon, which is, for people who aren't familiar with it, is sort of out in the middle of nowhere. It's an ancient
Here in New Mexico.
Anasazi civilization, probably most likely a religious or site or training center. There's a lot of different theories about what it was. We do know that it was primarily abandoned in 1200, and that even up to the last 50 years that Navajo sheep herders had been living in that canyon itself. But there are a lot of things, because the Anasazi in that area did not have a written language of their own. They had a lot of rock art, a lot of petroglyphs and pictographs to kind of describe certain things, but even a lot of the rock art, people these days don't know what it all means.
Mm-hmm.
And they're, through the Hopis that I've talked to, Navajos and the Pueblo people I've talked to, there's certain symbols that they don't even have really context for, or a mythology about. There's no, so many of the symbols they do, various symbols for all kinds of different things, for sun patterns, for moon patterns, for corn, for changing seasons, for processions, potential trading episodes, things like that. But there are some symbols that just are kind of lost to time. So,
Right.
yeah.
That's where the whole notion of the Rosetta Stone enters into the background for this art, the art itself and the background and how we look at language. Now, one of the things that I'm really excited about and enjoy contemplating is the use of color as it's influenced by the landscape and the structures and the very essence of Chaco. And again, as John said, no one is exactly, well, I should rephrase that. There are people who think they know exactly what Chaco is about, but there has not been any kind of agreement. And I'm thinking of Lucy Lepard, who's been out there quite a bit and done quite a bit of work about Chaco Canyon, and she calls it falling into the Chaco hole. You know, you start getting involved in, well, it must be this. No, it must be this. So I would love to hear you describe a little bit of your experience of being there. Now, you weren't camping, you got to stay in where the park rangers stay.
Yes, they were very hospitable. It was very nice.
Well, they don't have that many people to talk to. They were probably glad you were there.
Maybe. Being sort of the inaugural for New Media Arts, they were a little bit expecting that I was just going to like set up an easel and start painting the landscape. So we had to kind of work around that a little bit. And I think they were not quite sure exactly what it was that I was doing. My work takes a little while to develop, and so it's not like I just sit down one day and like, here it is.
Right.
And through all those different things, and ultimately for me, it was a chance to really spend a lot of time with the archaeologists and the paleontologists and geologists, and archaeoastronomers and really kind of just study the area in a lot of different ways and kind of come up with my own theories. I mean, my work is sort of like that. All these drawings are sort of a theory, if you will, that doesn't ever really, it's surreal. I mean, that's really what it, so.
But Chaco itself is surreal. I
It
don't know how
is.
many people think that aliens made it, but it's pretty surreal.
I think daily there are probably park visitors that believe that aliens made it. The park rangers tell some pretty funny stories. There was one in which they were very nice and helped out with this German documentary crew, and it wasn't until a couple years later when the documentary came out that they didn't know that it was a show about aliens, and the guys were in some of the Grand Kivas waving their arms around and saying you could feel the vortex power and everything. So, you know, humans take things wherever they kind of want it to go. It's amazing to me sometimes that we have any languages that we can share and communicate at all. You know? So,
Well, that gets right down to the various flaws of language itself. Which,
Yeah.
you know, the post-structuralists will tell you that when I point to water, I'm not describing anything. I'm just using a verbal symbol for something that we think we all understand, but we all understand it differently. Am I talking about the flask of water? Am I talking about the lack of water in the Southwest? Am I talking about fresh water versus water that we can't trust? What does that bring up for you? Language is quite imprecise. And it's almost like subatomic particles. When you try and point at them, they go bye-bye and head off, and I'm going to simplify this, as a particle and as a wave, and they're gone. So language is like that for me. We start pointing to what it is not so that we might be able to see what it is.
right.
And I see that in your art, even though you're looking quizzical.
No, once again, I like that. It's giving me some things to think about. I mean, if I was an audience member, I'd be like, oh. No, yeah, I think that's the thing. Sometimes we're always trying to decide what it is that we know, and then use the world around us to kind of, build up that argument for our point of view. But the essential elements that we're dealing with, whether it's language or visual elements in painting or sculpture, yeah, we insert a lot of our own personal taste and influence on those things. But our own personal taste and influence is usually determined by other things. I mean, it's not that much of it that's truly independent. I mean, for me, it's all of the art that I've looked at in my life, and that's determines the flavor of the thing that I like looking at.
Right.
So
let's talk about looking. The act of looking at sunrises and sunsets at Chaco every day for a month, and the silence and the isolation of it. I know I want to romanticize about the experience that an artist would have at Chaco. I can't stop myself, I'm a human being. I'd like to hear from you what that experience might have been like. I spent a lot more time being unproductive than I probably being productive, because I spent a lot of time just looking at things. That's what artists do. I'm afraid I have to interject here. Bruce Nauman did a piece that essentially explains that all the time that you're spending in the studio, we're basing that on Marcel Duchamp saying that I'm an artist, so therefore whatever I do is art. And so what Bruce Nauman was showing in this video piece that he did was that you spend time in the studio sweeping. You spend time in the studio clearing the space. You spend time in the studio getting your materials out. You spend time in the studio reading some trashy book because you really just can't work. For him, this is my interpretation of a Bruce Nauman piece, and I can't think of the name of it right now, of course. Everything that's happening is art making. And it includes a lot of cogitating, stewing, and looking if you're a visual artist.
I think that's powerful. I think maybe I should sweep my studio more often. But no, I don't know. Someone, was talking about this work and said to me, it's like, oh, it's so ridiculously pretty. And it's sort of unintentionally that. I don't think that pretty is necessarily a good moniker for decent art, but the sunset and the horizons in New Mexico and the Southwest really just are amazing. And I will not lie to you. I mean, every day was like a mind-blowing sunrise, and every day was like a mind-blowing sunset up there. I just got lucky with the weather at the time I was there, and changing every day. I mean, you could paint 20 paintings of each sunset out there, and it would be vastly different because it just goes through this huge process of changing. And all the structures out there in the earth, they're all made to sort of replicate and be in harmony with the mesas out there. And so there's wide views of mesas and sunrises and sunsets, and thinking about structures of, anciently built for purposes unknown, and just their integration, even in their crumpled state of today. In the state of today, they still seem to have this weird integration with the environment and the landscape out there. And that, to me, obviously working with corrupted data and things kind of, breaking apart, it's pretty interesting to think that maybe somehow it could be integrated, or, but I don't know, these are musings. I don't feel like art is necessarily about, oh yeah, I got the solution, I just came up with it. And I think that one of the challenges for an artist is fighting that within themselves, like, how resolved is this? Certainly that's a goal, is to get to a place where things are resolved. But the best things sometimes just never really fully resolved.
I agree. My personal theory is that art is here to ask great questions of us as individuals, as viewers. When it resolves, it seems to lose a lot of tension, and I personally get bored pretty quick with something that's highly resolved art-wise, but that's a bit of a tangent. I wanted to talk about the piece behind me, which is called Desert Mesa Sunset.
Distant Mesa.
Oh, distant,
sorry.
The
type is very small.
Oh, it is. Distant Mesa Sunset. So, do you carry away this sense and sensibility of the palette of the light and the structures at Chaco, and come home and make something, paint the bands of color, or were you actually making images when you were at Chaco?
Well, I was making images when I was there. A lot of it sort of is kind of throwaway, like ideas, sketches, and things like that. Most of my work gets refined back in the studio. But, yeah, I mean, the visual concepts in terms of the bands of color and the sunsets are, like, imagine if in your mind, like your mind was so attuned that you could perfectly remember every amazing sunset you've ever experienced. Like, our minds are so attuned these days to all this junk information, it doesn't serve us that well. And we have all these amazing experiences all the time, but they're really elusive. Like, I mean, I kind of probably remember a couple sunsets that I've experienced in my life that kind of blew me away, but it's still fairly elusive in what it is. It's like the impression of it more than anything. But imagine if you walked through life where that was like a big part of your psyche and like who you were. Is this amazing, visual vocabulary for all of the natural experiences you've had in like vivid detail. I mean, it's probably in our minds somewhere. I mean, in some way, but I don't know that we could ever really extract that in all its glory. And most of my friends who are, realist painters and plein air painters, I mean, very few of them just paint without any reference. They usually either paint experiencing it, or they take photographs and they use the photographs to refer to. But there aren't that many that I know that just paint from their minds. So I think my experience is somewhat like that. I try not to I try not to, because this work is abstract, so I can kind of play around with it a bit. And I try not to overly determine it, but it's part of it.
Would anybody like to ask questions about Chaco and John's experience at Chaco?
What time of the year were you there, John?
I was there in the month of October. which is
That's
like,
beautiful.
Yeah, pretty
Amazing.
perfect. You kind of go from the hot harvest days and fiestas and all the way through to where winter really starts. Snow eventually comes down, so desert heat all the way through to like freezing nights by the end of the month.
Right.
Yeah, and the skies really start clearing out at that point in time too, so the star watching is just amazing.
I have a question about, you're obviously not a plein air painter, so what was your intent in the proposal for the residency, since they weren't aware of what you were going to do?
Well, the proposal really was about language and mark making. It was really more about, where all the drawings really are coming from a little bit, which is the concept of this language, pictorially described like rock art. We don't necessarily know what it means, and kind of using technology-driven influences to kind of come up with an esoteric language that maybe is also would be considered lost time if it had ever been anything to begin with. We're also kind of in this place. One of the issues right now, it's more of a Southwestern issue. Well, it's a world issue really, is that there are fewer and fewer Navajo speakers now than ever before, and without like some major effort to preserve some languages that aren't used as much, they're going to go away. And there is a preservation effort. It is still being passed down, but it requires people to study something that maybe isn't practical to their daily lives. But I would imagine in places like Papua New Guinea and the Amazon basin and things like that there are languages that we're just losing the time. So as we've lost old computer languages to time.
Good point.
There are several that I've learned that are in my mind that I never get to use anymore. But they're there, they take up part of who I am. So.
Any other questions about Chaco or Chaco-related questions?
Let's see. Yeah, I came in and I looked and I thought of computers, and then I thought, well, how is the first civilization around here? But they, when they developed the corn for a dry climate, they got the technology to, live out there and have a larger permanent place to stay. And then I looked at the little marks and I thought of the stones or the Navajo weavings with the lines and the color. And I just wondered, what there. And then I wondered, the geometric part of the pottery and the search for technology or structure in this early period, and then you're there in the computer age, another beginning change, a new technology, and what did you imagine what they experienced, or what was similar between your art process and their art process? And
Well, I think that's a good question. What I would say is that one of the fundamental changes of technology in our lives these days is that we have this new perspective on things. See, because we see outside of our own culture now, the internet's made it so that we're actually like perceiving ourselves as being perceived by other cultures and the things that we do in that way. And I think that people 800, 900 years ago, I don't think that they probably thought too much of their own culture outside of their own, this is a huge assumption on their part, but they didn't think that much about their own culture from the perspective of other cultures, that, you know, like seeing them and interacting with them. These days, I mean, everything we do, like how we dress, how we act, we're constantly kind of thinking about, well, this could be like recorded on video, or put on social media, or put on the internet somewhere, and other people are going to see me acting this way or being this way. And I think that's really culturally a very new thing. And I think that because of that, I think that anything people kind of do is sort of considered in their own minds like, I'm kind of doing this to, you know, communicate with other humans, even if it's the way people dress, for instance.
Oh, absolutely.
And, okay, so you could probably make some of those connections with the Anasazi culture, but I don't know, I think that that's a new thing, and since we're kind of in the middle of it, I don't think that we can even really understand it in its course in history.
So it sounds similar where the roads leading out there led to Mexico, where they traded with the advanced civilization, and all the nomadic tribes were they were in contact with. So there's a whole range of experience for them.
And I think that's one of the, you know, not to get too heavy into the history of Chaco, I think that's one of the most fascinating things about it out there, is because it's not, you know, it wasn't built in a place where a civilization just, you know, came up through farming.
Yeah,
it was
it wasn't
intentionally built in a place that's very arid and not, you know, easy to live there. And the massive roadways that were built for grandeur, they were built for massive amounts of trade maybe, but it was all kind of this intentional cultural gathering place. And that's why, you know, you have artifacts that travel hundreds of miles that are there in the excavation sites, things from deep in South America and from all over coastal regions in the United States. I mean, they were, you know, major trade, major culture.
Right.
And I guess just to draw, you know, very loose parallel back to what I was talking about, I mean, that's sort of the thing. We're in this new world that's happened in our lifetimes where there's this internet thing, and then all of a sudden you can, just as an individual, go and trade with people in China or whatever really, really easily. It's a whole new cultural exchange point, and it's made by our technology. And we're still dealing with what it means.
Yes, Gregory.
Yeah, John. So I was out at Chaco, we called it Learning from Chaco when I was in architecture school. And we were out there for 4 days, and we had to come back before we came back, etc. But one of the things that really struck me about Chaco Canyon was what I call their open system versus a closed system. And I sense that in the work here.
Yeah.
And one of the things, you had mentioned about theory and that whole thing, and as architects, we try and always, artists as well, come with some sort of strategy, which you probably working through. But what I'm seeing here are like 3 different addresses, I guess, in your presentation. And one I would call axonometric, or kind of, which are these, right? We call those axons. And how it sort of deals with space. And it seems like to me, that's sort of kind of, I don't know, in some kind of a way is the synthesis for me of a lot of what's going on here. But it seemed like you were interested also in the horizon, but you're also interested in the architecture and the markings, when you mentioned markings and stuff, because I come here initially thinking much more about landscape. And looking at this, and I could see to me, it really suggests the architecture. And so I just wanted to know if it did sort of suggest different modes of expressing the idea around Chaco.
Yeah, it does. And you kind of hit on a point that's, probably pretty well described from your architectural point of view. The axiometric interest is kind of more to do with the various location of the building sites out there. So there are, several different sites, and on first look, they don't necessarily have a very clear connection in terms of, like, this one's like over here up against a mesa, this is this little one over here in different ways. And actually the axiometric nature of it there is that all the structures were built along astronomical planes. So they were built for, these are theories that other people can answer better than I can. But they were built for viewing different events in both the changing patterns here on Earth, but also potentially in the sky. And what I mean by the sky is beyond the patterns of the sun and the moon. Most of the buildings are aligned either to solar viewing or to lunar viewing, depending on which the structure was. But I think maybe there's also some connections with different patterns in the stars up and beyond that. Mm-hmm. So the locations seem at first to be chaotic, scattered, random, but then when you start looking at it, they're actually on certain planes that are made for viewing, for instance, the solstice, both the winter and summer solstice and the different equinox periods. Right. And also, I know so far, various people are studying the lunar cycles, which is a longer period of time. It's like 11 years, I think. 13 years? 13 years. 19 years. Thank you, Terry.
Well, that opens up the discussion to a much wider viewpoint. I wanted to thank you for bringing up ideas of horizontality. I was sitting here wondering, is horizontality as important in other parts of the world, or was it with indigenous cultures earlier in our history or in prehistory, or is horizontality, it feels like such a massively important part of being in Chaco. So there's horizontality going on, and which is also kind of a structural thing. We tend to build more horizontally. There's the question of language, the question of optics, which, as you've brought up, we might be in, as we probably are in, as significant a point in time in history as far as optics go, how we see. Like John Berger's ways of seeing might not apply in another generation or two because of computers. Let's just simplify it to that. So we're seeing differently than the Renaissance one-point perspective, for example. Mm-hmm. We're experiencing horizontality in a different measure with the addition of time and timelessness that cannot help but be noticed at Chaco. No matter what you might call it, there's this sense of eternity or possibilities of eternity, and just how that might translate into a quotidian life where you do, as you mentioned, you watch the sun come up, you watch it go down, and you might have a much more personal relationship with the earth and the sky than we have today. So I'm just throwing all of this at you.
There it comes. Usually my course would actually dissect that and address it one-on-one, but to make a comment overall, yeah, I think that's kind of the multi-layered essence of what's kind of going on in my art. I feel like I'm actually trying to consider all these concepts at the same time, because I don't want to resolve any of them. I'm not a physicist, and I'm not a computer programmer, and I'm not a sociologist, I'm not an archaeologist, an anthropologist, I'm an artist. And I think sometimes, as an artist, what we're looking to do is okay, what's this world around us? What are all the essences of the world around us? And then sometimes we just have to combine it all together. Just looking at the Kerry James Marshall show in LA, and in one painting, his whole story kind of comes together. And, the perspectives change for every little element in the paintings. And, just in the course of just this one canvas, you can kind of get like almost a whole life, if you will, of a person, a character. And, I'm nowhere like that, but to some degree, the nature of optics and the nature of living with technology, and what you're saying about optics to me, what comes to my mind is, the thing about these days is like taking a photo is such an everyday experience now. People just grab their phone, take a photo, and then look at it right away.
Yeah.
It's such an instant process. It informs how they see the world because.
In fact, our lives don't seem real unless we've taken pictures.
Didn't happen.
And we're recording this, aren't we? So obviously it's real.
Right. Right, so therefore, it's real.
But those elements, like the elements of like how the technology in our lives informs how our minds are composed and how our experience is composed, is what interests me.
And at first glance, maybe not at the show per se, but in considering your work, I would probably initially say, that guy at Chaco, I don't get that connection. But now, having spoken with you and looking at the show, it's like, where else could this painter have been but Chaco for all of this to come together and yet not resolve?
Yeah, okay, well, you might be right. I don't know. I mean, I think it's just, I've lived in the Southwest now for 15 years, and it's just a constant everyday exploration of the world around me. If I was living the last 15 years in New York, you'd have a very different body of work
Right.
here. And but that's part of, I don't know, there's a weird, like, different thing too that our technology is kind of opening up to us. It's sort of a nomadic lifestyle, and that we're born into a culture or a place, where our parents lived, but even if we physically can't leave that space, we can go through our media and stuff and see and live in these other cultures and share with people in other parts of the world and kind of create our own cultures. I think that's my next body of work. Where it keeps telling me all these, social media feeds and different things being reposted and stuff has to be what comes next. But there's a real grace about just being able to walk in nature. The horizons out here, to answer your other question, we're just lucky because when you're in the Southwest, you can step outside and you can step on top of a mesa and you can see 100 miles. And there aren't that many places where you can just do that.
No.
Too many things blocking our lives and too many things that are kind of getting in the way of that.
So we really do live in that paradox here in New Mexico, I think, and that's why so many of us probably stay here and never quite know what's going on. So on that note, you were much more graceful about what you said. So I'd like to open the discussion up to comments, further questions, so that we can have, 10 more minutes with...
Have you ever thought about introducing a time-based element to your work?
I've thought about it a lot, and I've played around with it quite a bit. The people who can do time-based work and video editing blows me away. I mean, I think it's fundamentally really, really hard to do because you have to, to some degree, when you do that kind of work, you have to have all of it in your head because you have to be writing that story in your head in order to actually manufacture it. And I have a hard enough time just like writing like a single image, in my mind. So, the concept of like conjuring in the mind, like what it's going to be, I think in, video work and that kind of media work, I'm just amazed at the people who can pull it all together. Because when I've tried, it just becomes this big jumbled mess. And I can come up with like one frame, it's excellent. But the rest of it just doesn't, I'm gonna keep trying. 10 years from now, maybe I'll come up with something.
So you consider these to be static works?
Yeah, in a lot of ways. I mean, I think for me, you know, a friend was bringing up Seurat the other day, and I remember, like, Seurat was such a huge influence when I was really young. I like static works that they kind of they play around they dance around your mind a little bit, and you're kind of still trying to resolve them all the time, because then it's like a story you take with you, and it's like this is what it is. It's not. Yeah. So.
Mhm. By the way, I remember the name of that Bruce Nauman piece. If anybody's interested in checking it out, it's called Fat Chance John Cage.
I think I'm familiar with that. That's a good one.
Yes, David.
Using nature as a reference, I don't think is too surprising for high-tech sort of work, to be honest. A lot of people were surprised, like Julian Stansack, who we have a number of his paintings over there, they're all rooted in nature. So what he was really trying to do is capture nature, but not nature per se, but the sort of how he felt or the color impact of nature.
Yeah.
So a lot of his things, like right now, there were several what he called grass paintings. And when you look at them, you realize why he calls them that. But he would get down real low at different times of the day, and before and after a rain or whatever, and look at the grass and really just sort of look out at the horizon from the level of the grass. And the colors are very different, and you can see that sort of range of things. So I think his work, nobody would have ever believed that until he probably ever started talking about it. There's been several books written lately about him where they really show like some photographs, and you can kind of see how some of these really optical paintings, how they come about. And then the other painter too, especially when you guys mentioned the time-lapse thing, Liane Berkowitz, who was one of the founders of the Washington Color Group in 1945 and worked on stain painting very early on. Like all those guys, he used geometry as containers for color to look at the effect of color or color interactions. But he got kind of bored with that after a while, and he was doing stripes, very blurry sort of stripes and how the colors blend together and what have you. And then he went on a 10-year trip through Europe and the Middle East, mostly Israel, he and his wife, to paint outdoors. He wanted to be outdoors as much as he could. And he kept wanting to have something that was landscape reference, and where he was capturing the landscape. And those ethereal paintings that he did, it finally came to him. What it was is he was trying to capture the energy of nature. So sunset, sunrise, moon up, moon down, tide in, tide out, all those sort of things. He realized that that's really what his work was about. And so what he did was, those are actually, each painting is a time collapse of about a 10 to 12 hour window where the earth has gone through an energy cycle, where he's standing there the whole time, sort of observing it and taking notes and everything. And people just thought he was whacked. He was especially up in Scotland and things like that, where the days went on forever. So there are a lot of artists who, these really abstract paintings come out of nature and these observations. And I guess I do see a time collapse sort of in your work, John, because of the fact, and maybe it's suggestive, being Chaco Canyon and this sort of long and not understood history of it. But I think what ends up happening, in some ways, your collapsed data is sort of a time lapse, if you will, of something that went on before, and it just happens to be compressed now. And so in some ways, I think it does capture that, sort of the energy cycles there, this horizontality that you guys talked about, which is really, I think, a grounding, is really kind of, it's like landscape painting. Landscape painters, even when they want to go from landscape into abstraction, they always had a horizon, or always a horizon line in there. They couldn't get away from it. It's a grounding, it's a rooting, I think. But anyway, so I think these do have a little bit of a time element to them, and maybe it is just because of the very nature of that place. But I do think, in some ways, it captures that. So you might be further down the road on that than you thought. That's all.
Maybe, I appreciate you saying that. And I would say that maybe because I get bored easily or something, but that kind of the play and the concept of things just sort of having their own chance to kind of vibrate and move along. And there's, when you look at the work, there's different pathways where your mind can kind of search its way through it. That to me is maybe just my own personal fascination. It's like a puzzle nature. It's a game theory kind of nature to kind of look at life as not being so static, but as having different pathways to kind of move through it. And time, I think, is the same way. I think time sometimes goes really fast and sometimes goes really slow. There's different ways of remembering how you have those experiences.
I like what you said, David. I was going to say something about, I think all painting is time-based. If people would take the time to look at them. There's another piece.
The frozen kind of way.
Yeah.
Well, no, because I think painting now has been relegated to this kind of static, kind of just an old-fashioned thing now that we have a certain other kind of technology by comparison that is supposed to be more real or more filmic or more technological. So as a painter, I have to say, my work is very much about time because I think, well, I won't go into that, but what I see, John, in your work is a kind of vibrational thing. Somebody else said vibration, and that to me is about sound and about light, which are two kind of wavelengths. And it's kind of funny to be an artist who's interested in so-called scientific things, right? I go through the same kind of thing about, well, what is the visual? Why? What is that? One of the examples I would give is like in astronomy, people used to always know the sky through telescopes, and then they invented radio telescopes, and now there's just like computer telescopes that are just doing nothing but aiming at one tiny point, gathering data. And it's not visual anymore. They'll say, oh, optical astronomy, like painting. It's like an old thing, And it is, but it's our sensory experience. When you are under the night sky, you don't really care how many dots and dashes are coming down to the very large array. But that information too, as a code or as data, does become visual. And so what I like about your work, John, is that it does kind of weave in, no pun intended, but it goes in and out of all of those ways of experiencing phenomena as an artist. In terms of land, but landscape, you could call it that, but you could call it land, and you could call it time in the land, and you could call it, that experience in land deepens with time, and he got to spend that there. So anyway, just to have to speak to that in painting in general, but also the whole vibrational collective thing that goes on in experiencing.
Yeah, it really is true. And then, especially when you stand on top of a mesa and staring out the horizon landscape and the little bits of the detail, the strata and the layers, they just kind of vibrate and intermix in a way. And if you really do just watch over time and pay attention, you can see just that vibrational quality in the nature around us. So.
Well, John, we don't have any more time. I'm so sorry because this has been fascinating, and I've loved hearing from the audience, Terry and David and everyone. I just want to say thank you.
Thank you,
for
Kathryn.
taking the time and for making this work that allows us to think through our experience as humans. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good job.